My name is Elena Harper. I'm in my late 30s, a wife, now redefining what that word means, and someone most people would describe as steady, reasonable, maybe even forgettable in a room full of louder personalities. I've spent much of my adult life being seen as the calm presence who keeps things moving smoothly. The woman who remembers birthdays, balances schedules, absorbs tension, and makes sure everyone else feels supported. People often assume that because I'm quiet, I don't notice much. That's because I don't interrupt, I must agree. That's because I don't fight for the spotlight. I don't deserve credit for what happens in the dark, unglamorous hours of real life. I've learned that underestimation doesn't always come with malice. Sometimes it arrives disguised as comfort, familiarity, even love. And before you imagine raised voices or a dramatic takedown, I want to be clear, this is not a revenge story. It's not about humiliation. It's about something quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. It's about what happens when a woman finally names the truth she's been carrying alone, and how that truth rearranges power without ever needing to shout. What you'll hear is a journey through small moments that didn't seem important at the time, glances no one else noticed, sentences that landed wrong but were brushed off. A gradual shift where shared sacrifices quietly became a one-person achievement in someone else's narrative. This isn't a story about a villain and a hero. It's about how dynamics form when honesty is delayed and what happens when it finally arrives. I'm telling this in the first person because shared stories need shared honesty. I won't dramatize events or exaggerate emotions. There are no miracles here, no sudden windfalls, no perfect last lines. Just a sequence of choices, silences, and one moment of speech that changed how I saw myself and how others were forced to see me too. If you're listening because you've ever felt invisible in your own partnership, or because you've watched your contributions slowly rewritten by someone else's confidence, I see you. And if you're listening because you're curious how quiet dominance actually works, not as manipulation, but as self-alignment, then stay with me. This story unfolds slowly, deliberately. It's about awareness before action, clarity before consequence. And it asks a simple human question at its core. Have you ever wondered how many parts of your life exist only because you stayed silent? And what might change if you didn't? Before anything broke, or rather, before anything shifted, I knew exactly who I was to them. I was the dependable one. Not the exciting one, not the impressive one, the dependable one. In my husband's family, that role came with a particular kind of invisibility. I was greeted warmly, hugged politely, and thanked often, but rarely asked. Conversations flowed around me like furniture, placed too tightly together. There was space, technically, but no one expected you to sit there. If someone needed help organizing a holiday, they called me. If a crisis needed smoothing over, I was looped in quietly. If plans fell apart, I was the person everyone assumed would adapt without complaint. And I did, for years. At family dinners, I was usually seated beside my husband, slightly angled toward him, like an accessory designed to support the main display. He spoke easily, confidently. He had stories, jokes, and opinions. People leaned in when he talked. Laughter arrived on cue. I learned early that when I spoke, I needed to be efficient, gentle, additive, not disruptive. I filled in the details when he forgot them, clarified timelines, softened edges, never contradicted him in public. That felt disloyal, even when the truth nudged at my ribs. No one ever told me to stay quiet. That's the thing people misunderstand. Silence like mine is rarely enforced. It's rewarded. Smiles, approval, the label of being easygoing, low maintenance, mature. She's so understanding, his mother used to say, as if it were a compliment that required no further examination. Understanding in this context meant being flexible. It meant accommodating. It meant absorbing discomfort without making it communal. In our marriage, that role expanded naturally. When one of us needed to pause a career move, it was mine. When schedules conflicted, mine adjusted. When money was tight, I found ways to stretch it quietly, without ever framing those choices as sacrifices. They were just what needed to be done. And I told myself that was love. At work, I was different, still calm, still measured, but recognized. My contributions had names there. Outcomes were traced. Credit followed effort in visible ways. I didn't realize how much I relied on that contrast to balance what I wasn't receiving at home. Because at home, the narrative was simple. We were doing great. We were building something solid. We had made smart choices. But slowly, subtly, the we began to sound like a synonym for him. When people asked how he'd managed certain milestones, financial stability, flexibility, time to pursue new opportunities, he answered smoothly. He talked about discipline, vision, long-term thinking. And I would sit there, nodding, because none of it was untrue. It just wasn't complete. What I didn't yet have language for was authorship. The idea that being part of a we didn't mean erasing the individual hands that built it. I believed that love meant letting the ledger disappear. So when relatives praised him for being such a provider, I smiled. When someone joked that he was lucky to have such support, I accepted it as acknowledgement enough. Support sounded important, after all. I told myself I didn't need recognition, that my worth wasn't dependent on applause, that speaking up would only make things awkward. And to be honest, nothing felt wrong enough to justify disruption. There was no cruelty, no shouting, no obvious injustice, just a gradual reshaping of perception, mine included, where I became the background against which his story made sense. If you'd asked me then who I was in that family, I would have said, I'm the one they can count on. I didn't yet realize how dangerous it is to be indispensable, but unnamed. Because when people rely on you without seeing you, they start to believe the outcome exists independently of your effort. And when that belief settles in, correcting it feels less like clarification and more like rebellion. At that point in my life, rebellion wasn't something I recognized myself capable of. I thought strength had to be loud, decisive, visible. I didn't yet know that quiet people don't lack power. They just store it differently. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what makes moments like these dangerous. They arrive without ceremony. No raised voices, no sharp edges, just a sentence, that's unspoken to Esley, that lands like somewhere deeper than it should. We were at a small family gathering, nothing formal, just dinner, familiar faces, plates passed around without much thought. Someone asked my husband how he'd managed to pivot careers so smoothly a few years back. It was framed as admiration, the kind people enjoy receiving. He smiled and said, I planned carefully. I knew when to make the move. That was all. No mention of the months I'd covered more expenses, the evenings I'd taken on extra freelance work, the quiet recalculations I'd made so he could step into uncertainty without fear. None of that was visible in his answer. And yet, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I didn't even feel angry, not really. I told myself the question was about him, not us. That context didn't matter. That this was a minor omission, not a statement of ownership. I reminded myself that love isn't a competition for credit. Still, something shifted in my body, a tightening, a sense of being edited out of my own history. I noticed it most clearly when someone else nodded and said, You've always been so driven. Driven. It was a word I'd heard applied to him many times. I'd never heard it applied to me, even though my days were structured by necessity, not ambition. I wasn't chasing success, I was sustaining stability. And those two things look very different from the outside. That night, as we drove home, I considered mentioning it, just casually. Hey, when you talk about that time, it might help to include what we both did. But the moment passed. He seemed relaxed, pleased. I didn't want to disrupt that ease over something that felt technical, small. So I stayed quiet. That was the cut, not the sentence itself, but my decision to let it stand unchallenged. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how easily it happened again. Different context, same pattern. Someone praised our financial discipline. He spoke about his budgeting habits. Someone admired how flexible his schedule was. He talked about negotiating autonomy. Each time, the structure was the same. His choices, his foresight, his execution. And each time I nodded. What surprised me most wasn't his behavior. It was how quickly others absorbed the version of events he presented. Stories are efficient like that. Once told confidently, they become reference points. People repeat them, build on them, remember them. I realized that by staying silent, I wasn't just avoiding conflict. I was participating in the rewrite. At first, I rationalized it. I told myself that marriage is a shared organism, not a balance sheet, that correcting him would feel petty, that no one was intentionally excluding me. But the body remembers what the mind tries to smooth over. I began to feel a faint reluctance at gatherings, a subtle withdrawal, not resentment, something closer to vigilance. I listened more closely, not for betrayal, but for pattern. And the pattern was there. Still, I said nothing, because the cut was small, almost elegant, easy to explain away, easy to endure. What I didn't yet understand was that silence doesn't preserve harmony. It trains expectation. It teaches people what they can say without consequence. What versions of reality will go unchallenged? That first night, if I had spoken up, it would have sounded like clarification, maybe even collaboration. Later, it would sound like a contradiction. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. I went on believing I was choosing peace, that my restraint was maturity, that I was being generous by letting his narrative breathe. But generosity without boundaries has a way of becoming erasure. I didn't yet feel erased, not fully, just thinned, like a detail fading at the edge of a photograph no one meant to crop. The danger of the first small cut is that it doesn't bleed. It just teaches you how much you're willing to lose without making a sound. What begins as an exception becomes a pattern when no one names it. By the time I realized that, the behavior no longer startled me. It had settled into the background rhythm of our interactions. predictable, almost procedural, the same way you stop noticing the hum of an appliance after it's been running long enough. At dinners, conversations followed familiar arcs. Someone would ask about our lives. My husband would answer. I would supply a detail or two if prompted, usually logistical. Dates, places, minor clarifications that didn't challenge the story's center of gravity. I told myself that this was normal, that couples develop shorthand, that not every contribution needs to be acknowledged out loud. But there was a difference between shorthand and omission. When people praised our resilience during difficult periods, he spoke about endurance as a personal trait. When they admired how we'd made it work, he framed decisions as individual resolve. And each time I felt that same internal tightening, less sharp now, more familiar. Familiar discomfort is easy to mislabel as acceptance. I began to anticipate it, to brace myself gently the way you do before stepping into cold water. I knew which stories would come up, which phrases would be used, which parts of the truth would be compressed or left out entirely. And I stayed quiet because speaking would require explanation, an explanation I believed would sound defensive. I also began to rewrite the story internally, just to cope. I told myself that my contributions were invisible because they were seamless, that real support doesn't announce itself, that my role was to stabilize, not to shine. These narratives are seductive because they feel virtuous. There's a particular satisfaction in believing you're above recognition. It allows you to endure imbalance while calling it humility. It disguises self-neglect as grace. Meanwhile, the environment adjusted. Family members began directing practical questions to him instead of me. Financial inquiries, planning discussions, long-term assumptions. He became the acknowledged architect of our shared life, even in areas he rarely touched. I noticed how rarely anyone asked for my perspective anymore. When they did, it felt ceremonial, like a courtesy, not a curiosity. And I adjusted again. I spoke less, not in protest, but in efficiency. If my words weren't shaping the narrative, there was little incentive to offer them freely. I focused on execution, on making sure outcomes remained intact, regardless of who received credit. That's the quiet trap. The system continues to work, so no one questions how. At one point, a relative commented, "You're so lucky to have him. He's really held things together." I smiled and said, "We're a team." It sounded balanced. It felt hollow. That phrase, "we're a team," became my refuge and my erasure. It allowed others to believe in fairness without witnessing it. It allowed me to avoid confrontation while telling myself I was protecting something valuable. I didn't consider that I might be protecting the wrong thing. What I normalized most effectively wasn't his behavior. It was my own silence. I trained myself to absorb discomfort without reacting, to translate dismissal into misunderstanding, to frame absence as modesty. And because I never objected, no one learned to include me. Even he didn't. That realization came slowly, and it hurt more than the others. Not because I believed he was malicious, but because I saw how easily people accept the version of reality that requires the least resistance. I wondered briefly if I was being unfair, if I were projecting meaning onto neutral behavior, but the consistency of the pattern told a different story. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, the assumption that you'll adjust, that you won't correct, that you don't mind being summarized away. I was good at surviving those assumptions, too good. By the time I noticed the cost, it felt embedded, like changing it would require not just a conversation, but a redefinition of who I was allowed to be in that space. And I wasn't ready for that yet. So I stayed. I nodded. I rationalized. And in doing so, I taught everyone, including myself, that my presence was optional as long as the structure held. That's the quiet violence of normalization. Nothing explodes. Nothing breaks. You just slowly learn to live smaller. Roles aren't always given explicitly. Most of the time, they emerge from repetition, from what people come to expect and what you stop correcting. By the time I could name mine, it had already solidified. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who made sure everything worked while remaining pleasantly in the background. In my husband's family, this role was reinforced in subtle ways. When plans were discussed, people looked to him for decisions and to me for confirmation. When something went wrong, they looked to me for adjustment. When something went right, they praised his foresight. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. Efficiency loves predictability. I noticed how often people said things like, "You're so easygoing," or "You don't make a fuss," or "You're just happy to help." These were offered as compliments, and I accepted them as such, even as they quietly defined the boundaries of my participation. Being easygoing meant I wouldn't object. Being helpful meant I wouldn't claim ownership. Being calm meant I wouldn't disrupt the narrative. Over time, I began to feel a strange pressure to perform the role well, to live up to the version of me they'd grown comfortable with. If I spoke too strongly, I felt out of character. If I asserted myself, I worried it would seem abrupt or unnecessary. So I managed expectations by managing myself. I chose my words carefully. I framed contributions as assistance, not initiative. I deferred publicly, even when I led privately. I became fluent in the language of support without authorship. At home, this dynamic deepened. Decisions were discussed, yes, but often after assumptions had already been made. My input was welcomed, but not required, appreciated, but not integrated. I told myself this was a partnership, that not every voice needs equal volume to be valued. But volume isn't the issue. Agency is. The role I'd been assigned came with a quiet rule set. I was allowed to contribute, but not to define, to maintain, but not to narrate, to adapt, but not to redirect. And because I met those expectations so consistently, no one questioned them, including me. I remember one evening, overhearing my husband explain our household logistics to a relative. He spoke accurately and confidently. He described systems I'd designed, habits I'd established, solutions I'd refined over the years. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't acknowledging the origin. And when I later mentioned, gently, "I didn't realize you've been handling all of that," he laughed and said, "Well, you're better at the details." Better at the details. It sounded like praise. It felt like confinement. That was the moment I realized my role wasn't just invisible. It was containable. I was seen as capable within a narrow frame, competent but not directive, valuable but not central. And I had helped build that frame. I had chosen peace over precision, harmony over clarity. I had allowed my identity to be flattened for the sake of relational ease. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed restraint was maturity. What no one tells you is that maturity without self-advocacy becomes self-erasure. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply becoming aware of the shape I'd been poured into and how uncomfortable it felt to live there. Awareness changes nothing immediately, but it does make the silence louder. Once you see the role, you start to notice how often you're expected to play it, how deviation causes confusion, how assertion feels like a violation, even when it's justified. I began to understand that if I ever spoke differently, if I ever claimed space, it wouldn't be received as evolution. It would be received as a disruption. And that knowledge sat with me, quietly waiting. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic realization that demanded immediate action. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so small it would have been easy to dismiss if I hadn't already been listening more closely to myself. I was alone at the kitchen table, sorting through paperwork, old files, tax documents, emails printed and annotated, things I'd kept, almost instinctively, over the years. Not because I expected to need them, but because I've always been someone who documents what matters. As I moved through the stacks, I noticed how often my name appeared in the margins. Notes in my handwriting, follow-ups I'd sent, decisions I'd tracked, adjustments I'd calculated and recalculated when circumstances changed. It wasn't new information. What was new was the way I saw it. For the first time, I didn't frame these efforts as support. I framed them as authorship. I saw how many turning points in our shared life had passed through my hands quietly, how many risks had been absorbed by my planning, how much of our stability rested on choices I'd made without fanfare. And I realized something unsettling. If someone else told the story of our marriage using only public narratives, I would barely exist. Not because I hadn't contributed, but because I hadn't claimed. That afternoon, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clarity is different. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand expression. It simply rearranges your internal map so that old paths no longer make sense. I thought back to the dinners, the praise, the omissions, the way I'd nodded, smiled, reassured myself that none of it mattered as long as the relationship functioned. But relationships aren't machines. They're narratives, and narratives shape power. The shift came when I allowed myself to ask a question I'd been avoiding. If I continue like this, who do I become in 10 years? The answer wasn't tragic. It was quiet. I saw myself efficient, respected in abstraction, invisible in specificity, the woman everyone trusts, but no one truly sees. I didn't want that future, not because it was painful, but because it was small. That evening, my husband came home and talked about his day. I listened, as I always did, but something in me had moved, not away from him, toward myself. I noticed how often I preemptively minimized my contributions in conversation, how quickly I translated I did into we did, even when we blurred responsibility beyond recognition. I didn't correct him that night. I didn't bring up the realization. The shift wasn't about him yet. It was about permission. I gave myself permission to stop shrinking my language, to stop editing my presence for comfort, to consider that speaking clearly wasn't cruelty, it was honesty. That realization didn't make me loud. It made me still. Over the next few days, I felt different in subtle ways. I listened more, not just to others, but to my own reactions. When something felt off, I didn't immediately smooth it over. I let the discomfort sit long enough to understand it. I noticed how often my silence had been mistaken for agreement, how rarely anyone checked in to confirm my perspective. And I understood, finally, that silence is not neutral. It's interpretive. People assign meaning to what you don't say, and if you don't correct those meanings, they harden. The shift wasn't a decision to confront. It was a decision to prepare. I began to observe without participating as much, to document without announcing, to track patterns instead of reacting to moments. Not because I was planning something dramatic, but because I wanted to understand the full structure before changing it. That day at the kitchen table didn't end in action. It ended in alignment. And once you're aligned internally, the external world eventually has to catch up. After that afternoon, my silence changed texture. Before it had been reflexive, an automatic response shaped by habit and expectation. Now it was deliberate, observational, chosen. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't alter my demeanor in obvious ways. To anyone watching from the outside, I was the same calm, agreeable presence I'd always been. But internally, the posture was different. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. When my husband told a story that smoothed over my role, I noted it instead of correcting it. When someone assumed he'd handled a particular challenge alone, I let the assumption stand, temporarily. Not because I agreed, but because I was learning how deeply those assumptions ran. People often mistake silence for passivity. What they don't understand is that silence can also be a form of listening at full volume. I began to hear patterns I'd previously ignored. Which accomplishments were attributed to him by default? Which efforts of mine were reframed as help? Which narratives were repeated verbatim, without question? And I saw how confidently people accepted those stories, not because they were true in full, but because they were told without resistance. My husband didn't notice the change. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing had shifted. I was still supportive, still present, still engaged. The system was working. That's the paradox. When you've trained people to rely on your quiet labor, your strategic silence looks identical to compliance. At family gatherings, I spoke less, not out of withdrawal, but selectivity. When asked direct questions, I answered clearly, precisely, without minimizing. I stopped cushioning his statements, stopped translating his intentions into softer language. If something felt incomplete, I let it remain so. It wasn't punishment. It was data collection. I wanted to see what happened when I no longer protected the narrative from its own distortions. And slowly, I noticed something else. The discomfort wasn't mine alone anymore. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when conversations stalled, when someone looked between us, sensing a gap they couldn't quite name, when praise landed awkwardly, unbalanced. No one said anything, but something had shifted. Inside me, the silence felt powerful, not because it controlled others, but because it anchored me. I no longer felt the need to prove my value through constant contribution. I knew what I'd done. I had evidence. I had clarity. That knowledge changed how I carried myself. Subtly. Shoulders back. Pauses longer. Eye contact steadier. Quiet dominance isn't about asserting control. It's about refusing to surrender it. At home, I noticed how often decisions had defaulted to his framing. I didn't challenge them outright. I asked questions instead. Neutral ones, clarifying ones. What's your plan if that doesn't work? Have you considered the impact on our timeline? I didn't offer solutions immediately. I waited. At first, he seemed surprised. Then, I was mildly irritated. Then, thoughtful. He still didn't see the full picture, but the dynamic was shifting. What he didn't know was that my silence was no longer a shield for comfort. It was a boundary. I was choosing when to speak, choosing when to let things unfold, choosing when to intervene. And that choice gave me leverage, not over him, but over myself. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to explode. I was waiting for the right moment to be precise. There's a difference. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a form of authorship. It allows you to observe the narrative without being trapped inside it, to see who benefits from which assumptions, to understand the cost of every omission. I didn't know yet how or when I would speak. I only knew that when I did, it would be from a place of certainty, not emotion. And that made all the difference. What people don't notice when you're quiet is how much time you have to prepare. While the narrative continued uninterrupted, his confidence, his leadership, his smart decisions, I was building something parallel. Not in secret exactly, just outside their field of vision. I began by organizing what I already had. Years of emails, financial records, calendars, notes in my planner that tracked decisions and consequences with quiet consistency. I didn't gather these out of spite. I gathered them because clarity requires structure. I wanted to see the truth laid out end to end, without emotion blurring the lines. And once I did, the picture was undeniable. So many of our major life stabilizers had come from my foresight. Emergency funds I'd insisted on, insurance choices I'd researched, timing decisions I'd delayed or advanced based on careful calculation. His risks had been real, but they had always been buffered by my preparation. That wasn't a partnership imbalance. That was authorship misattributed. I also began paying attention to language. The exact words used in public settings, the phrases people responded to, the way confidence, once established, compounds itself. I noticed how often he said "I decided," when the truth was "we discussed," and how often "we discussed" actually meant "I adjusted." None of this made him evil. It made him comfortable, comforted by a system that never challenged his version of events. I didn't confront him with my observations. I didn't hint. I didn't withdraw affection or create tension. Instead, I refined my presence. When I spoke, I was concise. I referenced specifics. I stopped softening facts to preserve tone. I let accuracy stand on its own, even if it felt less pleasant. People responded differently to that. They listened more closely. At work, the shift was already natural to me, but now I carried it into personal spaces. I realized I'd been compartmentalizing my competence, shrinking it at home to avoid imbalance. That realization alone was humbling. I also began to document in real time, not to build a case against anyone, but to reinforce my own memory, because one of the most destabilizing effects of long-term invisibility is self-doubt. When your contributions go unnamed, you begin to question whether they mattered at all. The documentation was an antidote to that erosion. What they never noticed was how patient I was becoming, how detached. Not emotionally, strategically. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was waiting for alignment. Family gatherings continued. Stories repeated themselves. But now I could see the structure beneath them. I knew which moments were safe to let pass and which ones mattered. I stopped reacting internally to every omission, not because they no longer bothered me, but because I understood their role in the larger system. This wasn't about one dinner or one comment. It was about authorship. And authorship, once reclaimed, changes everything. I also noticed something unexpected. The more I withdrew from narrative maintenance, the more effort others had to expend to keep it intact. My absence created friction. Not overt, but subtle. Conversations required more clarification. Assumptions occasionally went unconfirmed. Small cracks. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory. Just enough space for truth to breathe. I wasn't planning a reveal. I wasn't rehearsing a speech. I was simply becoming impossible to overwrite. There's a difference between being quiet and being empty. I had been quiet for years. Now I was full of clarity, full of records, full of self-trust. And when you reach that point, you don't need to rush. You know that when the moment comes, when accuracy matters more than comfort, you'll be ready. They didn't notice the preparation, but preparation was already changing the outcome. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sense of victory, no moment where I leaned back and thought, now I have them. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more stabilizing. Certainty. It came late one evening, after I'd finished reviewing a set of documents I hadn't originally intended to line up side by side. Timelines, financial decisions, emails confirming who had initiated what, who had followed through, and who had absorbed the risk when outcomes were uncertain. When I looked at everything together, the pattern was no longer interpretive. It was factual. I saw how often my decisions had preceded his opportunities. How many times have I delayed my own advancement so he could accelerate? How frequently I had restructured our shared life to accommodate his narrative of progress. This wasn't a sacrifice as an abstract concept. It was labor, strategy, authorship. And for the first time, I allowed myself to name it without softening the word. The private reveal wasn't about discovering leverage over him. It was about discovering alignment within myself, about realizing that if the story were ever told honestly, I wouldn't need to exaggerate or defend. The truth was sufficient. That's an important distinction. Leverage rooted in distortion requires constant maintenance. Leverage rooted in accuracy stands on its own. I didn't feel angry when I reached that understanding. Anger would have implied surprise. This felt more like confirmation, a quiet closing of a loop I'd been circling for years. I also understood, in that moment, why speaking earlier would have failed. Without this clarity, any attempt to correct the narrative would have sounded emotional, subjective, easily dismissed. Now it wouldn't, because I wasn't reacting anymore. I was grounded. What surprised me most was the absence of urgency. I didn't feel compelled to act immediately. I didn't feel the need to confront, announce, or reclaim space publicly. That's when I knew the shift was real. When you no longer need validation, you can choose timing instead of impulse. I slept well that night. In the days that followed, I moved through familiar routines with a different internal posture. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I had already seen it by myself. That changed how I interpreted everything. When praise bypassed me, it no longer felt like erasure. It felt like incomplete data. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to correct them. I simply noted who was operating on borrowed confidence. I wasn't detached. I was clear. The private reveal also forced me to confront a harder truth. I had allowed this dynamic to persist longer than necessary, not because I was weak, but because I had mistaken endurance for virtue. That realization came with accountability, not shame. I didn't blame myself harshly. I understood the conditions that had shaped my choices, but I also acknowledged that clarity demands responsibility. Once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. And you can't continue pretending that comfort is the same as integrity. I began thinking about options. Not actions yet, just possibilities, different futures, different ways of speaking, different consequences. I didn't know which path I would choose, but I knew one thing with certainty. Continuing as before was no longer an option. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. Not my husband, not a friend, not a confidant. It was mine, and that privacy mattered, because it meant that when I eventually spoke, it wouldn't be to convince anyone of my worth. It would be to state a truth that already existed. That's the kind of power no one can take credit for. Clarity creates options, and options demand choice. Once I reached that private certainty, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads, not marked by drama, but by inevitability. I could feel it in the way familiar situations no longer fit, like wearing a coat that used to keep you warm but now restricts your movement. There were several paths available to me. I could continue as I had, armed now with awareness, but unchanged in behavior. That would preserve comfort, predictability, and the image of harmony everyone seemed to value. It would cost me nothing immediately, and everything slowly. I could confront my husband privately, lay out the imbalance, and explain how the narrative had shifted without my consent. That path promised dialogue, maybe repair, but it also carried a risk I understood deeply. Conversations without structural change often become emotional negotiations, where clarity is softened to protect egos. Or I could choose something else, a quieter, firmer option, one that didn't rely on persuasion or permission. The more I examined the options, the clearer one truth became. I didn't want to argue my way into visibility. I didn't want to beg for recognition that should have been inherent, and I didn't want to correct the story only to have it revised again later. What I wanted was alignment between truth and reality, and that required something irreversible, not destructive, but decisive. The decision wasn't about leaving. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about authorship. I realized that as long as the structure remained unchanged, any conversation would be absorbed, reinterpreted, and eventually neutralized. The system favored the loudest narrator. So I stopped thinking in terms of reaction and started thinking in terms of position. What could I do, quietly, legally, ethically, that would make the truth unavoidable without me needing to announce it? That question reframed everything. I began to see that the real choice wasn't whether to speak. It was how. Speaking emotionally would invite debate. Speaking strategically would invite recalibration. The decision point arrived not with certainty about outcomes, but with certainty about myself. I knew what I would no longer tolerate, not externally, but internally. I would no longer participate in my own erasure. That meant any next step had to be clean, measured, grounded in reality, not reaction. Something that couldn't be dismissed as a mood or a misunderstanding. Once I accepted that, the path narrowed naturally. There was one option that met all my criteria. It required no public confrontation. It respected the truth. It acknowledged my role without exaggeration. And once taken, it could not be undone by charm or narrative. It was irreversible, not because it caused damage, but because it restored accuracy. Choosing that path felt calm, almost boring. No rush of adrenaline, no sense of danger, just a quiet internal click like a door closing properly for the first time in years. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't change my behavior overnight. I simply committed to a sequence of actions that would unfold in their own time. That's something people rarely understand about quiet dominance. The most important decisions are made long before anyone else realizes a game has started. From the outside, everything still looked the same. We attended events, we spoke politely. Life moved forward without visible disruption. But internally, the direction had changed. I wasn't preparing to confront. I was preparing to move. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. Not because I refused to, but because I no longer wanted to live inside a story that required my silence to function. Once the decision was made, everything became remarkably simple. Not easy, but clear. I didn't announce anything. I didn't change my tone or posture in ways that would invite suspicion. If anything, I became more even, more composed. People often mistake calm for stasis. They assume that if you're not reacting, you're not moving. That assumption worked in my favor. The first steps were practical, quiet, unemotional. I reviewed our shared structures with fresh eyes. Finances, responsibilities, long-term plans. Not to dismantle them, but to understand precisely where my contributions sat and how they were recorded. I ensured my work was traceable. Not defensively, accurately. I stopped absorbing costs that weren't acknowledged. I rebalanced responsibilities in ways that felt natural but firm. I asked clarifying questions that required follow-through. When something depended on me, it was documented. When something didn't, I let it remain so. None of this raised alarms, because it didn't look like resistance. It looked like an organization. At home, I began declining to smooth over oversights. If a plan hadn't been fully thought through, I let it reveal its gaps, not with commentary, just with silence. That kind of silence changes things. It forces ownership. My husband began noticing delays, small inefficiencies. Things that used to resolve themselves now required his attention. He didn't connect this to me. He assumed circumstances had changed. In a way, they had. At family gatherings, I spoke when addressed and listened otherwise. I didn't volunteer context or correction. I allowed stories to stand on their own, incomplete as they were. And something interesting happened. People began asking follow-up questions. Not out of suspicion, out of confusion. The narrative was losing cohesion. I also began redirecting my energy. Time I'd once spent maintaining harmony was now invested elsewhere. Projects that reinforced my autonomy, relationships that saw me clearly, decisions that didn't require translation. This wasn't withdrawal, it was reallocation. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt focused. That's the difference between acting out of anger and acting out of alignment. One is loud, the other is surgical. There were moments of temptation to explain, to clarify, to step in and restore balance. Old habits don't dissolve quietly, but each time I returned to the decision I'd made, I would no longer carry what wasn't mine to carry. If accuracy caused discomfort, so be it. Accuracy is not cruelty. As weeks passed, the effects became more noticeable. My husband grew less confident in public storytelling, not because he doubted himself, but because the unspoken scaffolding I'd provided was no longer there. He hesitated, paused, looked to me occasionally. I didn't rescue him, not out of spite, but out of respect for reality. If he wanted to claim authorship, he would need to inhabit it fully. I wasn't removing support. I was removing illusion. The most striking part of that period was how calm I felt. No fear, no guilt, no rush to resolve tension. I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I was letting the truth reposition itself. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without explanation until explanation is no longer necessary. And by the time anyone realized something had shifted, the shift was already embedded. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came as subtle disruptions, small enough to be dismissed individually, but persistent enough to change the atmosphere. Like a room where the temperature has dropped a few degrees, and no one can agree why. At first, it showed up in hesitation. My husband paused more often when speaking about our life in public. Not because he lacked confidence, but because the automatic flow of his stories had been interrupted. Without my quiet confirmations, his narratives felt thinner. He began glancing at me mid-sentence as if expecting reinforcement. I offered none, not coldly, not pointedly, just neutrally. Present, but not participatory. That absence is registered. Family members noticed inconsistencies. Not enough to accuse, but enough to feel disoriented. Someone would ask a follow-up question that hadn't been necessary before. Someone else would redirect the conversation awkwardly. It wasn't a confrontation. It was confusion, and confusion is destabilizing when people are used to certainty. At home, the effects were more pronounced. Decisions he'd once made casually now required reconsideration. Plans that depended on my invisible labor stalled. Not dramatically, but enough to be inconvenient. He mentioned feeling off, tired, overextended. I listened. I didn't rush to solve. That was new. I wasn't withholding support. I was withholding substitution. I allowed him to experience the full weight of responsibilities he'd previously described as his own. And slowly, something shifted in his demeanor. He became less declarative, more tentative, less performative, more reflective. Not because he was failing, but because he was finally encountering the parts of our shared life that had never required his direct engagement. The most telling moments were the quiet ones. A bill he hadn't anticipated, a timeline he'd misunderstood, a commitment that assumed my flexibility without confirming it. Each time I responded calmly, factually, without urgency. I can't take that on. That wasn't discussed. I need more notice. These weren't accusations. They were statements. And statements, when delivered without apology, force recalibration. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He hit him. But the adjustment cost him something. Ease. The ease of being seen as the sole architect. The comfort of a narrative that smoothed over complexity. I could see the discomfort growing. Not as resentment, but as awareness. A dawning sense that the story he'd been telling might not be complete. Still, I said nothing. Because this phase wasn't about explanation. It was about consequence. When systems change, people feel lost before they understand the cause. That's human nature. We noticed the absence before the structure. Family dynamics followed the same pattern. I was no longer the quiet fixer. When things went wrong, there was a pause, a delay. Someone else had to step in, or things simply didn't resolve as smoothly. No one blamed me. They simply missed the function I'd been performing without realizing it. And that absence did more to communicate my value than any speech ever could. I watched all of this with a surprising amount of calm, not satisfaction. Clarity, the kind that comes from knowing you're no longer overextending yourself for a version of harmony that depends on your silence. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was allowing reality to surface. And reality, when unfiltered, has a way of redistributing respect. By the time anyone tried to fix what was happening, the imbalance had already revealed itself too clearly to be smoothed over. That's the thing about long-standing dynamics. People don't notice them while they're benefiting from them. They only notice when the benefits disappear. My husband began asking questions, not accusations, not defensiveness. Questions that arrived late, shaped by discomfort rather than curiosity. Have you been feeling overwhelmed? Did I miss something? You seem different lately. They were reasonable questions, even kind in their way. But they were framed around mood, not structure, around feelings, not facts. And that told me everything. Because if this were truly about my emotional state, reassurance would have solved it. An apology, a promise to do better, a renewed effort to be attentive. But this wasn't about attentiveness. It was about authorship. I answered him honestly, but briefly. I'm fine. I'm just being more intentional. I don't want to assume things anymore. Those responses unsettled him more than anger would have. They didn't give him anything to fix. No emotional emergency, no clear misstep to correct. Just a boundary. At family gatherings, the discomfort became more visible. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt tentative. People hesitated before praising. They looked between us more often. Someone once said, trying to smooth things over, "You two make such a great team." I smiled and said, "We both contribute differently." It was the first time I'd reframed that sentence publicly. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't accusatory, but it was specific. And specificity breaks illusions. I could feel the collective recalibration, the subtle realization that something had been misunderstood, perhaps for a long time, that the narrative they'd accepted so easily might have been incomplete. No one challenged me, but no one repeated the old assumptions either. Later, my husband asked quietly, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" It wasn't a defensive question. It was a regretful one. I thought about that carefully before answering. Because I needed to understand it fully first, I said, and because saying it sooner wouldn't have changed the structure. That was the truth. Earlier, any attempt to correct the story would have been absorbed and neutralized. Too easy to dismiss as sensitivity. Too easy to promise change without enacting it. Now the structure had already shifted. The cost had already been felt. And that's why it was too late to fix things in the way people usually mean, by smoothing discomfort without altering power. Fixing would have meant returning to a version of harmony that depended on my silence. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't try to reassert control. Instead, he sat with the realization that something foundational had changed, and that it couldn't be undone by good intentions alone. That realization was painful to watch, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I could see how unprepared he was for a world where my presence wasn't automatically supportive, cushioning, compensatory. And I understood, in that moment, that clarity often arrives too late to preserve comfort, but just in time to preserve dignity. There was no explosion, no dramatic reckoning, just a quiet acceptance that the old dynamic had run its course, and that whatever came next would have to be built on something more honest. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, no rehearsed grievances waiting to be released, just two people sitting at the same table we'd shared for years, speaking with a level of precision we hadn't used before. He began. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me, "about contributions, about assumptions." I waited. Silence now was no longer avoidance, it was space. "I don't think I realized how much you were carrying," he continued. I thought we were just doing what worked." What he meant was, what worked for me. I nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I don't think you were being dishonest," I said, "but you were being incomplete." That word landed. Incomplete doesn't accuse, it clarifies. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He listened in a way he hadn't before, not passively, but attentively. So I spoke, calmly, factually, without heat. I talked about patterns, not moments, about how decisions were framed publicly versus how they were made privately, about how silence had been interpreted as consent, about how credit, once misattributed long enough, becomes assumed. I didn't list sacrifices. I described systems. I didn't accuse him of taking credit. I explained how credit had accumulated in one direction because no one, including me, had corrected the flow. That distinction mattered, because it allowed him to understand without feeling attacked. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said something that surprised me. "I don't know how to fix this." And for the first time, That wasn't my problem to solve. I'm not asking you to fix it, I replied. I'm asking you to see it. That was the heart of it. Not repair, recognition. We talked about what would change, not in grand terms, but practical ones. How decisions would be discussed, how narratives would be shared, how acknowledgement would be handled in public settings. Not as a script, but as awareness. He asked if I was angry. I considered that. No, I said. I was, a long time ago. Now I'm just clear. Clarity doesn't demand an apology. It demands adjustment. He apologized anyway. Not dramatically, not performatively. Just a quiet acknowledgement of impact, of assumption, of comfort taken for granted. I accepted it. Not because it erased the past, but because it recognized it. The confrontation ended the same way it began, without spectacle. But when we stood up from the table, something fundamental had shifted. Not power, perspective. He understood now that my silence had never meant absence, that my steadiness had not been passive, that my support had not been automatic. And I understood something too. Speaking calmly without heat had preserved my dignity in a way no emotional outburst ever could. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. The truth, spoken clearly, was enough. I didn't become a different person after that conversation. I became a more accurate one. That distinction matters because it reframes growth not as transformation, but as alignment. I didn't shed my calm nature. I didn't harden. I didn't adopt a sharper voice or a more forceful presence. I simply stopped shrinking. Who I am now is not louder, but clearer. Not more assertive in volume, but more precise in language. I no longer offer my labor without naming it. I no longer absorb imbalance quietly and call it love. That doesn't mean I've lost generosity. It means my generosity has boundaries. In family settings, I speak when something involves me. Not defensively, not preemptively, just factually. If a story is told that includes my work, my name is part of it. If it doesn't, I let it stand, without rushing to support it. People adjusted more quickly than I expected. Some apologized, some recalibrated silently. A few seemed embarrassed, not by me, but by their own assumptions. I didn't soothe that discomfort. I let it do its work. With my husband, the dynamic is different now. Not perfect, but honest. Decisions take longer. Narratives are shared. Credit is discussed explicitly, which once would have felt transactional, but now feels respectful. We are more intentional. And intention, I've learned, is the real marker of partnership. What surprised me most was how this shift affected my sense of self beyond the marriage. I found myself less tolerant of invisibility in other spaces. Not because I demanded attention, but because I no longer participated in my own omission. When someone summarizes my work inaccurately, I correct them, calmly, once. I don't apologize for clarity. I don't soften facts to protect egos. And the world hasn't collapsed. If anything, it's become simpler. There's a relief in no longer managing perceptions that diminish you, in no longer translating yourself into something easier for others to consume. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control. It's about coherence. When who you are, what you do, and how you're represented finally align, you stop leaking energy. You stop negotiating internally. You stop rehearsing conversations that never happen. You just exist, fully, accurately. I'm still the reliable one, still calm, still capable of holding complexity without drama. But I'm no longer invisible. And if someone tries to treat me that way, it's immediately obvious to both of us. That clarity is not aggressive. It's stabilizing. I don't regret the years I spent being quiet. They taught me patience, observation, and endurance. But I don't romanticize them either. Silence can be a teacher, but it's not a home. Now, when I sit at a table, any table, I take up the space my life has earned. I don't demand it. I don't perform it. I simply allow it. And that has made all the difference. There's a quiet myth many of us are taught early in life, that if you work hard enough, sacrifice deeply enough, and stay gracious long enough, recognition will eventually find you. But recognition doesn't arrive on its own. It follows clarity. This story was never about a dinner or even about a marriage. Those were just the settings where something more fundamental played out, the cost of staying silent in spaces that benefit from your presence but don't fully see it. For a long time, I believed that keeping the peace was the same as preserving love, that being understanding meant being flexible to the point of disappearance, that if I didn't insist on being named, it would somehow make my contributions purer. What I've learned is this: shared stories need shared honesty. Without honesty, we becomes a convenient blur. It allows one person to stand in the light while another holds the structure in the dark, not because anyone intended harm, but because silence makes imbalance efficient. The moment I spoke wasn't powerful because it was dramatic. It was powerful because it was accurate. No exaggeration, no accusation, just truth, delivered calmly after I'd done the internal work to stand behind it. And that's the part I hope stays with you. You don't need to shout to reclaim yourself. You don't need to humiliate anyone to be seen. You don't need to explode to be heard. But you do need to stop participating in your own erasure. Silence can be strategic, but only if it's chosen and only if it's temporary. When silence becomes a habit, it stops protecting peace and starts protecting imbalance. Speaking up doesn't always change other people immediately, but it always changes you. It aligns your inner reality with your outer life. It closes the gap where resentment grows. It restores authorship over your own story. If you're listening and recognizing pieces of yourself here, if you've been the one who makes things work without being named, who smooths, absorbs, adjusts, I want you to know this. Your calm does not mean consent. Your endurance does not mean absence. And your contributions do not need to be invisible to be meaningful. The moment you decide to tell the truth, clearly, calmly, without heat, you shift the balance. Not through force, but through accuracy. And accuracy has a way of outlasting everything else. I'd like to leave you with one question, and I genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. In what part of your life have you been quiet to keep things running? And what might change if you chose clarity instead?